Jean stood in front of the hotel, gazing at the imposing facade of the building he was about to enter. Everything about him was deliberate, from his perfectly polished black shoes to his tailored suit. Yet, the moment he crossed the threshold, he felt the weight of stares settling on him, heavy and mistrustful. Every employee seemed, with just a glance, to have already judged and categorized him into a group where he didn't belong. Their eyes swept him from head to toe, lingering on his shining shoes before climbing to his skin. His dark skin, which to them had no place in such a luxurious setting. A discreet gesture, a fixed smile, almost mechanical, as if rehearsed in a poorly acted play. Then, as expected, one employee stepped forward with a polite, yet coldly feigned demeanor. "Sir, may I help you?" The question was a formality. The conclusion had already been written. "I'm sorry, but I'm afraid you're not authorized to be here. Perhaps there's been a misunderstanding." Jean listened without flinching, letting the words roll off him like rain on his impeccable suit. He felt no need to justify himself. Why explain who he was, what he owned, or why he was there? The real show was about to begin, and these gatekeepers, so proud to protect this space from him, would soon bear silent witness to their mistake. When he was politely asked to leave, Jean made no move to resist. He simply nodded calmly and turned away, his shoes clicking lightly on the pristine marble floor. The door closed softly behind him, but he smiled. The absurdity of the situation struck him, and an inner laugh welled up. What they didn't yet know was that this hotel, this temple of luxury they so zealously guarded, belonged to him. Yes, the key to this empire was in his pocket, and soon, they would all realize that the man they had judged by his appearance, the one they had excluded from their world, was in fact its master. Standing outside, Jean glanced at his watch, patient. Very soon, everything would change. Jean took a deep breath, fixing his gaze on the building's facade one last time before stepping away. The satisfaction of rising above their judgments, of not needing their validation, gave him unshakable strength. He had prepared for this moment. It wasn't the first time someone had tried to reduce him to mere appearances, but this time, their fall from grace would be all the more brutal. What they had overlooked was his resilience and his journey. He had faced obstacles like this hundreds of times. Their snap judgments were merely echoes of a world unwilling to evolve. As he walked away from the hotel, his phone vibrated softly in his pocket. A message appeared. "Everything is in place. They won't see it coming." Jean smiled faintly, appreciating the irony of the situation. Today, he wouldn't fight against their prejudices. He would simply rise above them. Soon, the same employee who had coldly turned him away would understand that it wasn't his place to decide who belonged to this world. As he walked, Jean thought back to the day he had signed the acquisition papers for this hotel, never having set foot inside. He had wanted to observe, to understand, before asserting himself as its owner. Today, the waiting was over. At the street corner, he paused briefly to savor the mental scene playing out in his mind. The doors of this empire had closed against him, but soon they would open with reverence. Not because he would present papers or titles, but because the undeniable truth would reveal itself. Money might open doors, but dignity could not be bought. And Jean knew that true power lay in how one chose to respond to injustice. Jean turned on his heel and prepared to join his team, waiting a short distance away. Everything had been meticulously planned. The press conference scheduled for that afternoon, organized by his firm, would unveil his new plans for the hotel. There, under the cameras and in the presence of those who had dismissed him, Jean would speak. And this time, he would be the one handing over the keys. Hours later, Jean found himself in the grand reception hall of the hotel, surrounded by journalists, cameras, and most importantly, the employees who had ignored or rejected him earlier. The room was bathed in golden light, but a palpable tension hung in the air. Everyone present sensed that something significant was about to happen, though no one seemed to know exactly what. The employees stood at the back, stiff and frozen, their forced politeness wavering as they began to realize something was amiss. Some exchanged nervous glances. The employee who had earlier asked Jean to leave stared fixedly at the floor, aware that something had gone wrong but unable to grasp the full extent of his error. Jean stood at the center of attention, wearing the same elegant suit as before, but now flanked by a team of collaborators. The contrast between the earlier scene in the lobby and the current one couldn't have been starker. The man they had judged was now the central figure, and everyone was waiting for him to speak. Journalists adjusted their cameras as Jean stepped up to the podium. He took a deep breath, savoring the last moments of silence before he began to speak. He didn't need to raise his voice. Every gaze was already locked on him. "Thank you all for being here today," he began calmly, sweeping his eyes across the room. "This building has a long history, a place of prestige, power, and luxury. But today, it represents something deeper. It symbolizes what we aspire to see in the world." The employees stiffened further, realizing the direction Jean was taking. "Isn't it curious," he continued with a subtle smile, "how appearances can so profoundly shape how we are treated? How, despite all the luxury and elegance of a place, certain attitudes remain trapped in a past we should have left behind." A soft murmur swept through the room. Journalists scribbled notes feverishly, while the employees began to sweat under the growing discomfort. Jean paused, then slowly reached into his pocket and pulled out a set of keys. He raised them slightly, ensuring everyone could see. "What you may not know," he began, his voice calm but each word cutting with precision, "is that I've held the keys to this hotel for quite some time." The room fell into a stunned silence. The employees stared at him in disbelief. The staff member who had earlier asked him to leave felt his knees weaken. Around the room, reactions varied. Some employees hung their heads in shame, while others gaped at Jean, unable to process what they were hearing. Jean waited patiently, letting the reality sink in. Then, with unnerving composure, he continued. "This morning, when I entered my own hotel, I was deemed unworthy of this place. I was asked to leave, not because I didn't fit the clientele or couldn't afford it, but simply because of who I am. Because of what I represent to some." The employees could feel the weight of the cameras, the silent judgment of the public. They had been exposed, their behavior distilled into the pure essence of the injustice they thought they were above. Jean stepped closer to the microphone, his eyes locking onto those who had ignored him. "Today, I am not here for apologies. I am not here to humiliate you or seek revenge. I am here to remind you that prejudice, no matter how insidious, does not define who I am. But it does define what this place risks becoming." He paused again, letting his words sink deep into their consciousness. "This hotel will change. Not just in appearance, but in essence. I will ensure that every person, regardless of their background, their color, or their means, is welcomed here with the respect they deserve. Because what we're building here is more than just a luxury hotel. It's a new era." Jean stepped back slightly from the podium, observing the stunned faces of the employees. The lesson was delivered, and the message was clear. Appearances deceive, but dignity endures. After the conference, as journalists dispersed and murmurs faded into the grand hall, Jean stepped away from the podium. He stood for a moment, taking in the scene around him. The employees who had dismissed him hours earlier now avoided his gaze, aware that there was no escaping the truth. The staff member who had asked Jean to leave earlier stood frozen, leaning against the back wall, looking lost. Jean decided to approach him, not to humiliate, but to offer a moment of reflection, an opportunity to understand the weight of his actions. "You," Jean began calmly, his eyes fixed on the employee, "do you remember what you said to me this morning?" The man swallowed hard, unable to respond. His face flushed red, and his gaze dropped to the floor once more. "I'm sorry, sir," he murmured faintly, barely audible over the buzz of departing guests. Jean nodded slowly, but he wasn't looking for empty apologies. He studied the man for a moment, carefully choosing his words. "It's not me you owe an apology to. It's yourself." Jean let the silence hang for a moment before continuing. "You see, moments like this define not only who we are but also who we choose to become. Today, you made a choice based on appearances and prejudice, not reality." The employee, visibly shaken, nodded timidly, still unsure of what to say. Gene, though firm in his words, was not seeking revenge. He wanted to plant a seed, to provoke introspection. "I'm not going to fire you, if that's what you're worried about," Gene said, surprising the man. "I want you to stay. Because only by witnessing the transformation of this place will you truly understand what you've done." The employee finally looked up, his eyes filled with a mixture of emotion and realization. He nodded, trying to speak, but words failed him. "Go," Gene concluded. "Do better from now on. It's not a weakness to admit your mistakes, but it is a failure not to learn from them." The employee nodded again before quickly walking away, leaving Gene alone for a moment. As the man disappeared down the corridor, Gene felt a mix of satisfaction and contemplation. He knew this was just the beginning of the change he aimed to bring. A few minutes later, another employee approached. She appeared older, perhaps a supervisor, her face a blend of respect and shame. Unlike her colleague, she hadn't directly participated in the incident, but she knew her silence had made her complicit. "Sir," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly, "what you did today, it was necessary. Thank you for giving us the chance to correct our behavior." Gene regarded her for a moment, appreciating the honesty in her words. "Thank you for admitting it. It's not easy to self-reflect, especially in a place like this. But trust me, change is always possible." She nodded, then stepped away, her shoulders visibly lighter. Gene took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the prejudice he had faced for so many years slowly lifting. It wasn't over yet, but today had been a significant step forward. He wasn't here to destroy or humiliate. He was here to rebuild, to redefine what this place could be. The winds of change were now blowing through these opulent halls. Gene, master of his destiny, was ready to rewrite the story, one lesson at a time. Gene's story is an invitation to reflect on our own biases, to embrace diversity, and to build communities where respect and equality are not just ideals but lived realities. Remember, this is not just about keys and doors, but about the power to rewrite our collective narratives, transforming places of judgment into spaces of acceptance.